Reddit, what's your family's dark secret? NSFW. My grandparents swapped spouses. My grandmother on my mother's side had an affair with my grandfather on my father's side. Everyone got divorced and then my grandfather on my mother's side fell in love and married my grandmother on my father's side. Family reunions were fun. My great-grandfather was a Christian Scientist minister. They believe that the mind can cure the body, and he told the family of a girl with diabetes, a treatable disease, to pray the sickness away. The girl soon died and the girl's father killed my great-grandfather in a murderous rage. My great-aunt had a second child and gave it up for adoption because she was a newly single woman and didn't think she could provide for both kids. This apparently caused a lot of drama in our family back in the 70s and people stopped talking to each other over it. My generation never heard a single word of any of this. Then, one day, my mom calls me to tell me about my new cousin. I was baffled and figured someone had a kid. Nope. That little girl that was given up for adoption was now in her 40s and hired a private investigator to find her biological family. She's since been assimilated into the family and I see her regularly at family events. My uncle was investigated for the Green River killings. Years later he was investigated for the Spokane prostitute murders. He was good friends with Yates, who was found guilty, and his saliva was found on a beer can near a dumping site. When I was a little girl, my mom told me to never get in his car if he tried to pick me up. Funny enough, he sells life insurance. My father raped my 15-year-old sister on my 6th birthday. I had nightmares my entire childhood about her being sent away, seeing my dad arrested, and worse. My mother and aunt covered it up and didn't tell me the truth until I was in my early 20s. Edit 2. Protect all children. Thanks for everything but this is most important. Edit. This got some serious attention already. I appreciate everyone's comments and I've tried to respond. I want to say something about this sister of mine because I've spoken from my POV, but she's at the center of this. When I was 6 I'm sure I adored my mother. But, you know who I remember taking care of me? My oldest sister. She was my favorite person. She read to me about Tom Thumb and sung to me and I was pretty literally her real live baby doll. When this happened, she disappeared and I didn't know why. When we reconciled I got to tell her what I remember about her and I got to hug her, but she can never truly understand how I pined for her my entire childhood and how I still do. I'm 46 and she's 55 now. We don't live close and I haven't seen her in 15 years. She won't see this, but I love you sis. I always have and I always will. My paternal grandma got pregnant with my dad when she was something like 17 in a small town in northern Louisiana. She claimed my grandpa was abusive, so she and her sisters took off for New Mexico when she was 19 and my dad was a little less than 2. On the way she surprise delivered my uncle, who bears little resemblance to my dad. Obviously mom is same. She then very openly carried on an affair with her 60-ish-year-old boss until she met my step-grandpa. He was a great guy, raised my dad and uncle as if they were his own. As the story goes, step-grandpa is overjoyed when grandma gets pregnant with his baby, but my aunt comes out bearing a remarkable resemblance to grandma's boss. Oh. Boss's wife shows up to the happy house with a gun and a checkbook. Says she's using one or the other to get my grandma to go away. So in like 1961 my grandma gets a check for something like $10,000 and she and step-grandpa buy a brand new house. All good, right? Nope, grandma had innumerable more affairs. Was married twice more and my step-grandpa felt so betrayed after he raised all 3 kids he committed suicide. Grandma tried to swoop in and take over his social security survivor benefits somehow. Right before grandma died a few years ago she kicked her last husband out, cleaned out fire joint savings, and she and my aunt and cousins took off for Arkansas. Right after I was born my real grandpa shows up on our doorstep with little boxes full of letters, birthday cards, newspaper clippings of my dad's activities like sports and getting his PhD. Grandma had gone through all of them and taken the cash and checks and kept them for herself and just to be cruel returned the remnants. Turns out grandpa was a great guy who was never abusive. Missed his son like crazy and was always working blue collar jobs so could never really get away. Grandma actually bolted when she was 19 because she'd had an affair with the local book salesman and his wife came only with a gun. No checkbook. Edit wow. This blew up. Little worried to check the comments. I guess to add my grandma was very sweet to me and before I knew all the inside drama I just knew her as a very attractive older woman who smoked a lot but otherwise was a pretty typical grandma. She was also a great mother-in-law to my mom and one of my brothers has severe autism and my grandma was amazing with him. So she's very much a mixed bag depending on who you were in her life. I was a little hurt when she took off for the last time because she cut my dad and his family completely out and we don't know why. We only heard she died from my great aunt. From the pictures I've seen she was stunningly gorgeous. Had she been born a millennial she'd have made a perfect Instagram influencer so I think getting men to do her bidding came very natural to her. A super distant uncle in my family used to get in a lot of trouble with cops. My nan and great aunt used to hide him, once hiding him in a freezer while cops searched the house. One day he ended up kidnapping an ambassador, successfully ransomed him off. Tried escaping the country via boat but the captain realized he was a crook and tried to take him to the cops. Distant uncle instead holds captain at gunpoint and dives off the boat several kilometers off land. Police never found him and assumed he drowned. Decades later my nan got a letter from him, confirming to all of us he was alive and well. Found out when I was a teenager that my mom had an affair with my dad's brother and that my brother and I might not be my dad's biological kids. Edit. Just to clarify, it was rough for a long time and parts of my family are broken. But I love my mom and dad mistakes and all. Great grandmother ran a brothel. Great grandfather was murdered by brothers who decided they were both in love with my great grandmother. Great grandfather was in the KKK. The KKK was quoted in the newspaper as saying something like we take care of our own. The brothers were never seen or heard from again. Edit. Brothers were two siblings, unrelated to my family, and not members of the KKK. I don't know how they plan to divide time with great grandmother. Also, when my grandfather helped lay out my great grandfather for burial, 9 bullets fell out of my great grandfather. My grandfather went away to fight in Vietnam and when he came back my grandma was pregnant with my mom. We never knew who her real dad was. I've told this story on here before. My mom's relationship with my dad was following a divorce. She had 2 kids with her first husband, a son and daughter, when she started dating my dad. As she was pregnant with my oldest sister, my dad molested my oldest sister. As soon as it happened, she found out about it. He tearfully confessed when confronted, told her he was sorry, and begged for forgiveness. She forgave him. He kept molesting my sister. Had my mom done the right thing? Had she called the cops or even just left him? I would never have been born. Instead, I was the product of a child molester with an anger management issue, who tormented and terrorized my family until my mom left him when I was 7. My oldest sister is broken. She's got borderline personality disorder, or perhaps narcissism. She has never had a healthy relationship with another human being. She is abusive of her siblings and none of us have a real relationship with her. I found all this out 17 years ago. It's weird to consider that I shouldn't exist, that I shouldn't be here, but it doesn't trouble me. I try to be a good person. I'm definitely not my dad. Edited to add well, this blew up. I definitely wasn't expecting that. Thanks, kind stranger, for the gold. To add a bit of context, surprisingly, only one person even asked. No, my oldest sister is not my mom. She was only 7 or 8 when I was born. For the people offering support, thank you. But I'm good. I'm a happy person. I sometimes have anxiety, but it's mostly related to the state of the world we live in. Not my family background. I work in education. I'm more than aware of the statistical improbability of any individual's existence. That I shouldn't exist if my mom had exercised good judgment doesn't affect me. I'm here. So I try to be good. Everyone should try to be good, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. I'll add one story about my family that doesn't really change anything, but maybe it will give some of you the illusion of resolution. When I got married, my sisters were the maids of honor for my wife. My brother was our photographer. As we were ramping up to the wedding, My oldest sister began acting erratic. She got into a fight with my brother, typical, and laid down an ultimatum. It was him or her. She did the same thing with my dad. She didn't want to be in the same place as him. So I called her up and we had a talk. I basically spelled it out for her. This was my wedding. It was going to play out the way I wanted, and she was not to make any ultimatums. If she said it was either her or my brother, then she'd be out. It's that simple. When I told her that, she immediately dropped her protests of my brother's presence. Because, going back to a point I made in one of the other comments, I'm not in a position where she can hurt me emotionally anymore. I don't put up with her but as far as her ultimatum about my dad, well, him being at my wedding, and her bailing on it because he was there, felt too much to me like an example of the bad guys winning. I told her that I had no problem disinviting him from the wedding, and that's exactly what happened. From that point, on occasion, when I'd see him he'd complain about it, and when he did, I basically said, "You're lucky we have any kind of relationship at all, because you don't deserve one. I wouldn't push it if I were you." And he dropped it. That was that. My dad basically took a life and wrecked it. He should have no reward for that. And the person with the wrecked life, she's now in her 40s. I know, factually, that people can get help for their problems. If she ever does that, I'll be there for her. But I can't force her to do it. Maybe someday, in time, but I'm not counting on it. My mom was raped when she was 14. Her dad, my granddad, tracked the guy down and shot him dead in a bar. My grandfather died in 1946, before my dad was even born. We were always told he drove his truck into a ditch while drunk, fell asleep, and asphyxiated when the tailpipe got clogged with mud. He was in his early 30s at the time. Well, I got into genealogy a couple of years back and found a bunch of records and newspaper articles about the incident. Turns out grandpa wasn't alone in the truck. He was with an underage girl, less than half his age, who also died alongside him. Obviously, this was not my grandmother. The newspapers didn't say it explicitly, but there was heavy insinuation that there was some side of the road romance happening when the fumes apparently overtook both of them. I still haven't told my dad what I found. Not sure I ever will. My grandfather's uncle fell in love with an underage girl. He got drafted into the war and had to leave. When he came home he found out she had died. He dug up a grave and kept her dead body in his bathtub. We just don't talk about it and I've never met that side of my family. Edit. First off, holy it, I did not expect my comment to take off as much as it did. I went to bed and woke up this morning to a million emails. Secondly, I called my mom to see if I could get some answers to all of your questions. Turns out the guy was actually my grandmother's cousin. He was a Marine in the Korean War. Apparently when he got back he was told she had died. My mom has no idea how old she was or what she died of. He became so distraught he went and dug up a grave, put her in his bathtub, and kept trying to revive her. He was discovered only a couple days later. My mom says it was a small town and once her freshly dug up grave was discovered they just put 2 and 2 together. No one talks about it. Only my mom obviously. My granddad was into dating students before it became something people lost their job over. That's how our family got started. He taught, then gave extra credit to my grandmother. My great grandmother was married to her first husband, an Italian mobster in New York, in the early 1920s. They had 4 kids. In 1928, 6 years after they were married, she disappeared and no one in the family knew what happened to her. They all quietly assumed her husband had her killed, as it was known he was very abusive to her. Nope. She ran off with my great grandfather. They moved to Philadelphia and had changed their last names. They were always very secretive about their past. No one knew the original family names or where they had come from, until I took a DNA test and matched with a third cousin that was descended from her first set of children. Her original 4 children were sent to orphanages because the first husband couldn't take care of them. It was a big surprise for both families and some very hurt feelings for the children she had abandoned. They are in their 90s but it affected them their entire lives. As far as I know, only my mother and I, possibly my stepfather but I'm not sure, know that my real father wasn't some guy my mom dated in college but a stranger who grabbed her and assaulted her. I didn't even know this until she told me when I was a teenager. I found out that my high school best friend is my cousin. My parents were freaking out when I brought her over. Not as much as when my dad was best friends with her dad in the 70s and his dad panicked because of the resemblance. Turns out granddad had an affair with her gran around 9 months before he was born. No one in their family knows, and only a handful in ours. Edit. Sorry, I wrote that at 1 AM and didn't think anyone would read it. Just want to clarify. So, granddad has an illegitimate son. Dad's best friend in the 70s was the illegitimate son. Was just coincidence they are best friends. Almost 40 years later I become best friends with granddad's illegitimate son's daughter. I'm female. We were best friends in the usual sense. Nothing else, haha. I'm British. Not from Alabama. No sex with family members. My granddad was just very good at sleeping with other people's wives. This is the only other child we know about though. Birth mum was a prostitute. Adoptive mum tried to kill my dad with rat poison. Grandmother was a thief. Her brother was killed by their father. I don't really think that this is a dark secret, but it's something that I didn't find out until I was an adult. Which was mostly because my grandma doesn't like talking about it. So I think it counts. When I was going through some old stuff of my grandma's after the death of my mother, I found some old photographs of a baby. Not my mom because my mom had dark, almost black hair at birth and this baby was blonde. And a birth certificate for someone named Francesco, mom's maiden name. I asked my grandma about it and at first she didn't really want to tell me, but I gave her some space and she must have decided that I deserved to know. Or maybe she was just tired of having the secret, because she eventually told me. Francesco, who they called Frank, was my grandma's son. He was my mom's younger brother by a couple of years, apparently, and Frank was 3. My grandma's ex-husband kidnapped him and my grandma never saw him again. My grandma's ex-husband, my grandfather, although I don't consider him such, the least reason for which is because I never met him, was involved with the mob and it's suspected that he took Frank with him back to Sicily. But nobody is really sure. My grandma is pretty sure that he would have taken my mom too, if my mom hadn't been sick and in the hospital due to tonsillitis at the time. It's kind of given me an idea of why that side of my family can be kind of withholding about things. I didn't know my mom had been married before my dad until I was a teenager, but it also makes me feel really sorry for my grandma. My dad is abusive and keeps my mother in debt so she can't take us and leave. We look like a perfect middle class family from the outside, but boy is it on the inside. My dad's brother is a pedophilic sex offender. Was caught with over 52,000 images of CP on his computer, as well as bragging about abusing children as young as 5. My grandmother had an affair with my aunt's high school boyfriend's father. It became very awkward when my aunt married said boyfriend, and had a kid with him. Why? Because my grandmother married said boyfriend's father. My aunt now has a kid with her stepbrother. One of my aunties was a very ill woman, like oxygen to get out of the chair. Going upstairs is a 1 a week thing if lucky. Her son is a prick. When she refused to pay his drug debt off for the nth time because she had no more money, he poured petrol all over the house and threatened to burn her to death. The fumes were enough for her to pass out. He panicked, took a handful of pills, then panicked at that decision and called himself an ambulance. Didn't even mention his mum. Police turned up with the paramedics, arrested him and took her in the ambulance. I disowned him instantly. My grandfather's dad tried to join the Nazis, but his family moved him to Canada to prevent it. Edit, an apostrophe. Also I put my grandfather's dad instead of great grandfather because there's no blood relation. My mother was adopted, and we never met him. Only info I've gotten is from my grandfather. I am distantly related to the Unabomber. My mom's parents were uncle and niece. Her dad married his brother's daughter. Their family was on the East Coast and they ran away together to California. They had 2 kids, my mom and her older brother. All of us are a product of incest. My grandfather broke it off with his first wife because she got knocked up by my grandfather's brother, who was also married, while my grandfather was deployed during the Malayan emergency. He had stress and anxiety issues the entire time I knew him, and I know it costs a part of himself to forgive his brother to keep the family together. The worst part? She named the kid after my grandfather. Tried to pass him off as a junior. The kid is now in his 50s and is in prison, selling prison art. My uncle, the Protestant minister, was doing wealth management on the side. Turned out to be other people's wealth into his pockets, got caught, and killed himself before they arrested him. My dad's family is messed up. His cousin told her husband that if he didn't stop smoking she'd divorce him. So instead of quitting he lied about having cancer. When he went to the hospital he told her he was getting treatment but instead smoked at the hospital. This all happened before I was born, but yeah, her husband lied about having cancer for almost a decade. My dad is the only normal one in the family. My great-great-grandma went out to dinner with her husband one night. Her husband thought she was looking at other guys and brought her to a hotel room nearby and slit her throat. He left her to die, but she survived and then escaped and left him. We didn't find this out until a few years ago through an old newspaper. Before the days of Ancestry.com and whatnot, my cousin and his wife went to Ireland with idyllic intentions of tracing our family heritage. They never spoke of it again. Until years later when they admitted it repeatedly dead-ended at mental hospitals and jails, and they got so discouraged they quit. My family was smuggling diamonds in the Apeldoorn area of the Netherlands from the late 1800s up until World War II. They got pretty rich off it too until the Nazis invaded and took most of them into concentration camps. My great-grandfather, while on the trains to a camp, convinced himself and several others to jump from the trains. As they did, they were gunned down by Nazi soldiers, and my great-grandfather was one of the only survivors. Grandparents on my stepmother's side paid a hitman to take out my father. Luckily the guy had morals. He met my father and after talking to him a bit ended up telling him what he was originally there for, and that he was going to return the money. My uncle was apparently in prison for a couple years for sexual assault. No one ever spoke of it, and I didn't find out until after he suddenly died years later. He suffered from schizophrenia, and when his wife left him after years of refusing treatment, he wandered off into the woods and froze to death. Now we don't talk about either of those things. Edit. Oh, and my father only has one testicle. The other one never descended, and my grandma either didn't notice or was too embarrassed to take him to see a doctor about it. One of my cousins fondled another cousin when the latter was only 2 years old. I refuse to acknowledge the pedo's existence. Edit. Since multiple people are asking. The offender was 14 at the time. I've been waiting for this thread cause I just found this out over Christmas. Dad's ex-wife had 2 kids from her previous marriage. One of them, the younger one, was born deaf because her ex-husband shoved her down the stairs during pregnancy. Came to find out that he did not do that. He was the nicest man ever. She lied because the deaf kid is actually her cousin's. She ducked her cousin when he was staying at their house for a bit and had an inbred kid with health defects. She hid this from her husband. This all came to light when the older brother, born from her husband, no health defects, told his dad that he accidentally walked in on bomb banging the cousin. Dad got a paternity test, confirmed it. Deaf brother still doesn't know. Praying no one buys him a 23andMe for Christmas ever. My mother is light-skinned because my grandma was raped by a white man. I found out at my grandma's wake. We had always been told we were part Native American. Grandfather tried to axe murder my dad. Cousin is a porn star. By this time, I'm sure you've heard this all before. My great-grandmother supposedly summoned the devil to have my great-grandfather murdered. It's an old urban legend, but if you met her, it might not seem far off considering she's quite the strange old woman and has a voice like that of that little midget lady from Poltergeist but in Spanish. My grandma's ex-boyfriend got put in jail for murder BC. He killed a dude that also liked her. Also, she and my granddad would have quickies during TV commercial breaks. I learned this Christmas that my great-grandfather belonged to the Ideal Club. They harassed and murdered local Puerto Ricans. My grandfather was raised in a home loaded with guns that was protected by multiple guard dogs. My grandma told me she was informed by her grandpa's mom, that her Phil killed 22 men. She also mentioned that those were just the ones she knew about and there were probably more. My grandma even dug out old pics from the 30s to prove it because we didn't believe her. Edit to clarify, this was not a white supremacy group. He was a Mexican immigrant and everyone in his club was too. Edit 4 images. First one is my grandpa with one of the dogs. Grandma said they had 3 or 4 around the property. Second one is the man himself and the family. Third is the club photo with all of the members. Bootleggers. Shot some folks. Hung some folks. Lost some folks. Found some folks. Incest. A lot of it. Edit. Nope. We weren't racist at all. Mainly white on white criminal violence. Close bracket. I'm pretty sure my uncle was in the Hells Angels or at least affiliated with them. His funeral was interesting. The procession to the cemetery was loud and proud. Edit. I'll give a little more detail about him for you guys since this thread got so popular. I've been told he was a great mechanic even in his teenage years. There's a story of how he took a car completely apart and all the parts were laying around my grandmother's backyard. Grandma told him that she would give him $100 if he could put it back together again and get it running, and he did. Also, that would have been the late 60s. Early 70s, so $100 was worth a little bit more back then. He even had his own repair shop at one point. He was a motorcycle drag racer and quite popular with the ladies. At his funeral there was a line of ex-girlfriends that came to cry over him. All of my uncles were bikers, but I think he's the only one that became an outlaw type. I guess you could say he was the black sheep of the family. However, he was loved by everyone. I only really saw him on holidays and I was only 12 when he passed away, so I didn't really get to know him personally. My mother would tell me stories of how he would pester her to no end when they were kids. He would hide under her bed until she fell asleep and yank her off the bed. Then other times he would hide outside her bedroom window and shoot her with his BB gun.